My name is Gordon Hein. I'm the Vice President of the Asia Foundation, based in our headquarters in San Francisco. We failed to bring an Asia Foundation banner from San Francisco as a co-organizer, but we do have some materials about the foundation out where you checked into the conference. It's my great pleasure to moderate the first of our three panels today. This one focusing on the rise of Asia and the future of aid. For this panel, we have an outstanding group of four presenters representing different institutions and perspectives on development cooperation in the region. And we're going to give primary attention to three countries, Australia, China, and India. I think it's quite fitting that our discussions over the course of this day on the future of aid begin with a session on the rise of Asia. And that is because, quite frankly, so many of the most important issues and trends and drivers of change in international development and in the arena and discourse on international development cooperation are taking place right here in the Asia Pacific. First of all, as was noted earlier, there's the extraordinary success of countries like China, like Indonesia, India, other Asian countries in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the space of a single generation. It's an achievement unprecedented in human history. But it does raise the question in some people's minds of, well, then why should we continue aid to Asia? Is it still needed? Is it still justified against other competing priorities? But as we also heard this morning, at the same time, the hard reality is that there are still massive poverty in the region, as well as continuing challenges of conflict and state fragility, which didn't get discussed this morning in a number of Asian countries, including middle-income countries. So as we look at the changing landscape on development cooperation in the region, if you start with the OECD DAC countries, it's noteworthy that while many European donors are reducing their aid budgets in Asia and closing country offices in many parts of the region, two of the most dynamic and growing aid programs among DAC donors are located in and largely focused on the Asia-Pacific region. And here I'm talking about Korea and of course, Australia. In the case of Korea, you have the story of an extraordinarily successful and rapid transition from being a major aid recipient to joining the DAC and hosting HLF4 and putting international development issues on the G20 agenda. And of course, here in Australia, we've seen such a dramatic expansion of Australia's aid program, an expansion that is deeply felt and much welcomed and much appreciated in the region. As Australia thinks through its own role, its own interests, its own priorities in the Asian century. So I'm pleased we're going to have hear from two Australian participants on our panel. And finally, there's the rapid and I would say very exciting emergence or growth or increase of important Asian non-DAC development actors, particularly China and India, who have increased their development cooperation with countries in Asia and even beyond the region, building on what are decades of experience in South-South cooperation. And of course, as they've increased their role, it has significantly altered and expanded the global development landscape, the existing aid architecture, and indeed the whole debate about what we mean by development cooperation and aid, which is rapidly changing. So with that as introduction, let me turn to our presenters. Each of the four panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, give or take, and we'll have an opportunity for your comments and questions at the conclusion. Let's wait until all four of the presenters give their remarks. You all have the bios, I believe, for the four speakers, so I'm not going to provide lengthy introductions. But let me call then on our first presenter will be Roderick Fraser, who is the first Assistant Director General in the East Asia Division at AusAID. He was formerly Senior Analyst on Indonesia at the Office of National Assessments in Canberra, and indeed spent many years in Indonesia, and also spent 10 years with the Asia Foundation in Indonesia and Cambodia. We're really grateful to Rod for joining us. I know he has to leave soon after this to get on an airplane, but he was kind enough to make time available to join our discussions. So Rod, if I could call on you, you can perhaps use the podium if that's all right.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And first, I want to thank the organisers for the invitation to speak today. It's a real pleasure to be among so many friends and talking about a really important subject. With the 10-minute limit, I will dispense with the sparkling and provocative speech I was going to deliver and speak as a public servant normally would. Look, I just wanted to today outline how Australia's aid program is adapting to the changes in the Asia Pacific in order to achieve our policy goal of reducing poverty. A little bit of context. In October last year, Prime Minister Gillard released a white paper on Australia in the Asian century. The white paper highlights that Asia is undergoing massive economic, social and political transformation, and that in that transformation there are many opportunities for Australia. On current projections, Asian economies will increase their share of world output, overtaking North America and Europe by 2020. Only 40 years ago, these countries were less than 1/3 the size of North America and European economies, and most Asians were hungry, poor and unhealthy. Korea was poorer than most African countries. War and political conflict affected almost every Asian country. That's only a few decades ago, but today Asia is on the brink of becoming the centre of global economic activity. Many previously very poor countries are growing rapidly and have achieved what the international development banks call middle income status, countries like Vietnam, Indonesia. And I would stress middle income doesn't mean middle class. They're sometimes confused and conflated, and I'll talk about that a bit later, but they are middle income status. It's important to remember though, and I'm sure this has come up already, that in these middle income countries there are vast numbers of very poor people still, and these countries have yet to fully harness the benefits of dynamism to relieve poverty in their countries. 70% of the world's poor live in middle income countries, so it's not a simple picture. In addition, many of those living just above the poverty line remain at great risk of slipping back down into poverty if there was a financial or other catastrophe. This kind of poverty picture goes hand in hand with our assessment of stability and the prospects of prosperity in East Asia. The levels of poverty and the associated inequality and vulnerability pose risks to continued economic growth and prosperity. Social cohesion and political stability are critical to long-term prosperity, and having a large share of the labour force unused limits a country's growth potential. We mustn't forget how recently Asia was riven by conflict and how much still is affected by conflict, political oppression or fragility. It is in Australia's national interest, strongly in Australia's national interest, to assist middle-income countries manage these challenges. Strong economic growth for the region will increase stability and demand for Australian products and services, particularly in areas such as mining, agriculture and education. However, the Asia-Pacific region's experience of growth and poverty reduction is not homogenous, and another group of countries is facing even bigger challenges. Within the poorest countries in Asia that AusAID operates in, more than half the population lives on less than $2 a day. These countries have not capitalised on the region's economic growth and remain stuck in poverty, including conflict-affected states like Myanmar and geographically isolated small states such as Timor-Leste and some of the small Pacific Island states. Preventing instability and improving economic opportunities in these countries is a primary goal for the Australian aid program. The cost of intervention, if security breaks down, can run into the many billions of dollars, as we've seen in countries like Timor-Leste and the Solomon Islands. Australia's approach to aid delivery in each of these environments is targeted to ensure that we're able to have the biggest impact on poverty for the taxpayer dollar. In middle-income countries, rapid economic growth has increased governments' abilities to raise revenue, giving them larger budgets where the money raised can be used to meet the needs of their citizens. In Indonesia, domestic revenues to the government of Indonesia are more than 200 times the size of the Australian bilateral aid program. The new reality for donors, including AusAID, in many countries of the Asia region is that money is not the challenge. Many of these countries have very large budgets, fairly sound fiscal bases, and the challenge is how to spend that money well, how to convert that money into good development outcomes for their people. And so budget execution, good policy planning is crucial, and it's not happening in many countries, including in Indonesia, where it wasn't so long ago that budget execution was 30 or 40% below budget forecasts. We need to leverage capabilities and resources of middle-income countries. We need to create networks, bring in technical prowess that helps these countries. And we need to do far more than simply transfer resources or transfer a kind of dollar-for-dollar subsidy to these places. That's old think, and we're not generating anywhere near enough value for money in these environments if we're just doing that. As I said, Australia aid to Indonesia is a good example of the adjustment we're trying to make. We've changed our relationship. It's become a partnership of equals, genuinely. That's not simply rhetoric. We have a very close relationship with all of our partners in Indonesia. We've built trust over decades of close cooperation and long-term engagement. We're drawing on Australia's economic reform experience of the 80s and 90s by embedding advisors from the Australian Treasury and the Department of Finance at the heart of government in Indonesia. And those advisors have been in place for some years now, providing technical assistance directly to ministers and others on the reform agenda. This has helped to build an effective and genuine partnership and achieves massive leverage for our donor dollars. Building these partnerships gives Australia more confidence to work through government systems. We learn about partner government systems much more when we're close to them in the way we are, and can help to strengthen local institutions. Working through partner systems is a key commitment to improving aid effectiveness, and Australia has signed up to all of the international norms on this under the Paris and Busan partnerships. So we have to balance that against, of course, our obligation to safeguard Australian public money, but I think we're doing well, and we are channeling more and more of our money through partner government systems where it works. Our aid is also used to drive policy change and broader reform, such as in regulatory and legislative frameworks. In Indonesia, Australian funded advice has led to a much more competitive management of the radio spectrum, for example, and has led to Indonesia being able to raise around $650 million in revenue from the better management of the radio spectrum. And the technical inputs that we offered to help that happen were, of course, a tiny proportion of the revenue that Indonesia is now raising. We still need to make sure that our aid is reaching the very poorest, so we're also supporting activities like the National Program for Community Empowerment, or PANPM, as many of you would know it, to support the poor and disadvantaged. AusAID's approach includes trialling innovative approaches to delivering assistance and allows the Indonesian government to take successful innovations to scale. The bulk of the funding for PNPM, this is a jewel in the crown for President Yudhoyono. It's one of his highest priorities. Is most of the funding for that is coming from the Indonesian government itself, more than 90% in fact. Australia is only, although the number itself is quite large, it's in the hundreds of millions, our contribution in financial terms is a small minority. But we're intervening in clever and strategic ways to ensure that Indonesia's investment is much more effective than it otherwise might have been. A number of middle-income countries have long since graduated from receiving Australian aid. Malaysia and Thailand for obvious reasons, but China and India for other reasons. Some of these countries are becoming donors themselves. And China, for example, has an aid program that we think is probably larger than Australia's already. I was talking to Rani last night, who was saying that India's aid program this year is well over $1 billion and slated to grow much larger. So we want to work closely with these countries. We're finding that there is a kind of ebbing of traditional donor activity in much of Asia, certainly in the Pacific. And in many countries, Australia, China, Korea and some other countries are the large donors, along with Japan. Many European donors have left some of the countries that are most important to us. So we want to work with these countries. We were very proud that earlier last month, Foreign Minister Senator Bob Carr signed an agreement in Beijing on development cooperation with the government of China. It's only the second of its kind. It changes the relationship of one from donor-recipient to one of fellow donors. China doesn't like being called a donor, but fellow partners in the development of Asia and the Pacific. And it was a very positive experience, and I have to say it was very impressive to see the commitment and interest from Chinese officials in partnering with us. We're moving on to concrete collaboration very quickly. We've already sent a joint team to Papua New Guinea to look at health issues, and we'll be doing the same in Myanmar and elsewhere. Of course, Australian aid still flows to very poor countries, to low-income countries, and with 15 of Australian neighbours among the world's least developed countries, many of whom have only recently emerged from conflict, such as Myanmar and the Solomon Islands. We also have to remember that the traditional aid role is still absolutely crucial. And we're giving aid to those countries where there is not the sort of economic dynamism that there is in other parts of Asia. Conflict in particular in these places can have a devastating impact on economic growth by creating instability well beyond the life of initial interventions. In the Solomon Islands, despite recent economic growth, incomes have yet to return to the levels they were at before conflict started more than a decade ago. In these contexts, AusAID takes a more traditional approach to aid delivery by supporting governments to deliver basic services, including education and health. Education in particular is a key ingredient to reducing poverty in low-income countries and is the global flagship of the Australian aid program. International research has shown that increasing a boy's level of schooling by 1 year increases his earning potential by between 5 and 15%, and for girls the benefit is even bigger. Myanmar currently spends less than 2% of GDP on education, which is one of the lowest levels in the entire world. That's why we are soon set to become the largest donor supporting basic education in Myanmar, and we've pledged to give more than $80 million to Myanmar in pursuit of better education outcomes. We've also taken the lead on donor coordination in Myanmar, and it's a topic close to my heart. There was a kind of gold rush by donors and NGOs and multilateral institutions into Myanmar, and we think some of our friends, partners, behaved poorly in that context, not recognising the limited capacity of the Myanmar government, not recognising the drain on their resources caused by a constant procession of delegations, people putting forward activities and proposals that really weren't central to Myanmar's needs at the moment. We've placed a very high premium on coordinating our activities with other donors, with the British in particular, not weighing in outside our areas of focus or expertise, and doing our best to relieve the burden on, believe me, the very small number of Myanmar officials that can engage meaningfully with the outside world. So that's a kind of appeal I'm making to those of you from NGOs. Please do recognise that weakness in Myanmar. They're doing their best, but having, I think in Naypyidaw, 3 and 4 delegations a day is not helping the government of Myanmar to get on with the real work of development. In conclusion, Australia's aid approach to aid delivery is driven by a desire to have the maximum impact on poverty from a limited pool of resources. Our assistance is based on a thorough analysis of each country's unique circumstances. We also closely monitor the results of our assistance to ensure that it remains effective, and we adjust our program where needed. We turn off programs that aren't working, and we remedy those that aren't working as well as they should. We look to leveraging capabilities. This is a major theme of Australia's aid program, and resources to reach more and more people, not only from government, but also increasingly from the private sector, who can provide unique insights and solutions to development challenges. This approach is fundamentally about delivering value for money from the Australian aid dollar, delivering the maximum poverty alleviation impact for the Australian dollar, and demonstrating to the Australian taxpayer that we are achieving what we say we will do. This is our responsibility as a Commonwealth agency funded by taxpayers, and also to the governments of the region and to the poor people of the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rod. Really quite a comprehensive review of current Australian aid programs and emerging future directions in the region, and the attempt to, in fact, remain deeply engaged in the region, even as other donors may be reducing their role, and to calibrate the approaches to assistance to different types of countries and different types of groups in countries, and moving from, in many instances, in middle-income countries, from a traditional donor-recipient model to one of partnership and leverage of resources. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Stephen House, who's director of the Development Policy Center at the Australian National University and director of the International and Development Economics teaching program at the Crawford School. Dr. House was formerly chief economist at AusAID and also spent 11 years at the World Bank. And he'll also be talking a bit about future of aid from Australia to Asia and Pacific. Professor House?
Okay, thanks very much, Gordon, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I know you're meant to say that, but it's actually true. So I graduated from Melbourne University a long time ago, so it's very nice to come back to Melbourne University. And also, just before I begin, can I, on behalf of ANU, as one of the organisers, also extend my welcome to you all. Thank you all for coming. And just thank the organisers for all the work they did, both the partners at Lowy and Melbourne, and my colleagues at the Development Policy Centre, especially Robin Davies, who wrote most of the background paper, Macarena, who's not here, but got a lot of you here, and Jonathan Chang, who's been doing a lot of the work, and of course the Asia Foundation, although you don't have your banner, which was a mistake. I think you've really contributed to the richness of this program, and it is very rare to have such an international cast of characters considering these issues, so we should get some very interesting perspectives. The rise of Asia topic for this session is, of course, changing everything. It's already changed everything, and it's going to keep doing so. The pace of change is remarkable. When I came back from India to Australia in 2005, we defined Asia in Australia as East Asia, and I couldn't get anyone interested in India. Now it's all changed, and of course Australia is knocking on India's door, and we put India up as one of, I think, our top 4 relationships. So the world is changing very quickly, and of course that's having an impact on our own little world or community, that of aid and international development. As we've heard, aid is shifting out of Asia, and Asian countries are becoming important donors. And I think these developments are not without their problems, but overall they're very good trends. They're good for Asia and they're good for the world. So I'm going to let my much more learned colleagues from Asia take these ideas further. I'm going to address my comments to Australia and Australia's aid challenge. And I'm going to look at both at Asia and the Pacific. I think it is it's a sort of courageous but good decision this conference made to try and look at both Asia and the Pacific, because they're extremely different, but they're both very important for Australia. And so I am going to add my voice to that of Jimmy Rogers and try and bring in a bit of a Pacific perspective as well. So my argument's very simple. It's that aid is too important in Australia's relationship with the Pacific, and it's not important enough in our relationship with Asia. So I'm going to make some critical remarks about Australian government policy, but not about aid, right? So I pretty much agree with what Rod said. It's more about the place of aid in the broader relationship. So there is this remarkable symmetry that I mentioned last night in our aid relationship with these two regions. They are the two most important regions for Australian aid. And here I am just going to focus on East Asia, although you could make the same argument for Asia more broadly. But both East Asia and the Pacific get about $1.2 billion of Australian aid. They both have one big donor in that mix. It's Indonesia in East Asia, PNG in the Pacific. They each get about $500 million, and the rest is spread around other smaller countries. And that is about 2/3 of our bilateral aid. Right? So that we do have a strong focus on the Asia Pacific, and we should be proud of that. But after the numbers, that's where the similarity ends. In the Pacific, aid is the main game in our relationship with those countries. We are the major donor in the Pacific, and if there's a problem, it's invariably going to be an aid problem. So in Solomon Islands, we have problems with Ramsey. They don't like us. They do like us. They want us to go. They want us to stay. In Vanuatu, they want our police to come and help, but then they'll throw our police out, and we'll bring them back. It's that sort of. There are lots of those kind of aid problems, and if there are other issues, it's often, well, what can we get in return for our aid? So we want help with asylum seekers. What does Nauru need? Nauru needs more aid. Manus needs a special aid package. So aid becomes a bargaining chip. You don't hear politicians talking about the Pacific more broadly. You don't hear about what our vision is for the Pacific and what the long-term future should be. And where we do launch broader initiatives, frankly, they're often rather half-baked. So I'm thinking here of PESA Plus, which is the free trade agreement that we're meant to be negotiating with the Pacific. But when the government comes to release our trade policy, it doesn't mention PESA Plus. So are we negotiating PESA Plus or not? And similarly, the seasonal worker program, which is our policy to try to encourage labour mobility from the Pacific, for a range of reasons that I'm happy to go into, it hasn't taken off. And so while New Zealand has managed with a much smaller horticultural sector to get 7,000 Pacific Islanders a year to come, we get about 1,000. In Asia, the problem is the opposite. Aid is overlooked in the broader relationship, and that's clearest in this white paper on the Asian century, which Rod mentioned. If you search aid in that white paper, as I've done, you're more likely to come up with paid, laid, and said, right? You'll find a few mentions of aid and a couple of paragraphs that give a sort of overview, but there's not a lot of treatment. And remarkably, in Chapter 9, which is broadening and deepening the relationship, you won't find the word aid at all, right? Meanwhile, in our comprehensive aid policy framework, we're told that the aid program is going to expand from 1.2 billion currently. The plan is to 1.9. Now, whether that's going to happen, because the whole aid scale-up is in doubt, but I mean, that's a statement of intent on one hand, which is very contradictory to not mentioning aid, when you want to broaden and deepen the relationship. Surely, this 1.2 expanding to 1.9 is a very powerful instrument that we should be using in the Asian century, in our relationship with Asia. Well, why isn't it used? And I guess it's not that surprising. It doesn't really fit the narrative. Right? The narrative is that Asia is growing, there's a middle class, it's an economic opportunity for us. It's not meant to be a burden. So it doesn't fit the aid paradigm. I think it's also fair to say there's, among strategic analysts, the big picture thinkers, such as Hugh White, and I've said this to him myself. I mean, a lot of them are aid skeptics. So they question, not like us, we're the believers. There's a lot of skepticism about the role in aid. And then also, let's accept that for the important countries, or a lot of the important countries of Asia, we don't have that aid relationship, right? So for Japan, Korea, obviously we don't. China and India, we're winding our aid down. Among those important 5 that are highlighted, it's only Indonesia where we have a big aid relationship. So it's not surprising that aid doesn't feature in the white paper, but it's surely not sustainable either. You can't, on the one hand, have a big aid program, and then on the other hand, we'll think, well, actually, it's not really important for what we're trying to achieve. So that's the problem we have, I think, with these 2 regions. What should we do? Well, for the Pacific, we need a vision. We need a vision, and the vision has to be about integration. It's along the lines that Jimmy Rogers was talking about. These are not countries that can survive on their own. This is globalization, and they need to globalize and regionalize and become part of something much bigger if they're going to do well, and we should help them do that, and it's in our interests. It's an obligation on us, but it's also in our interests to do so. That vision has been around for a while, but only at the academic and bureaucratic level, and we really need that vision to emerge at the political level. Perhaps Richard Marles was getting close to that, but then unfortunately he left. He was the Parliamentary Secretary on the Pacific until very recently. We need a vision. We need to pursue that vision on a bilateral basis, right? With all respect to the good work being done by the Forum and the SBC, the Pacific is such a diverse region, we can't hope to reach an agreement with the Pacific all at the same time. That's why PACER Plus is not going anywhere. We need to do it on a bilateral basis. We need to issue an open invitation to countries in the Pacific that want to seek a closer relationship with us, or perhaps with us and New Zealand, and we need to take it on a step-by-step basis. So that's the overall vision and the approach. The specific focus has to be on labour mobility. What most Pacific countries have, they've either got natural resources or they've got people, and they're never going to be manufacturing hubs or even agricultural export hubs in most cases. What they can export are their people. It's been shown to work as a strategy. It's not the whole answer, but it is part of it, and it's something, in terms of integration, it's where we score the worst in Australia. We're still suffering the legacy of the whole blackbirding period, the expulsion of Pacific Islanders back in 1901. We've never recovered from that, and it's, one of the telling indicators is that there are more Samoans in Australia than there are Papua New Guineans. If you think about how many Indians there are in the UK, right, or how many ethnic Algerians, or ethnic Indians, ethnic Algerians in France, Samoans in New Zealand, that colonial connection we don't have with Papua New Guinea. So the Samoans come here because they become New Zealanders, and then they can come to Australia, but don't try to come if you're a Papua New Guinean. There are concrete measures we can take. I don't think I've got time to go into them, but we need an overhaul. We need to have specific and workable Pacific windows that promote labour mobility. We need to extend to the Pacific Islanders the same sort of privileges we extend to OECD countries. I mean, I think it verges on scandalous that we welcome European backpackers, but not Pacific Island backpackers. What about Asia? Asia, we need to find a narrative for aid. If we want to continue aid, we need to find a narrative for aid that is consistent with the Asian century. And for my money, that narrative, it's not rocket science. It's been articulated just now by Rod and by Peter Baxter. But again, we need that narrative to be brought into at the broader whole of government and political level. And that narrative is around the fact that Asia is still poor. We are hamstrung by this, $1 a day, $2 a day. I tried to live on that the oak tree has this living below the line, $2 a day, and we did it with my family last year. It's very difficult, and that's just for your food. Forget about your rent and all that. These are still poor countries. Aid is a positive in our bilateral relationship. It's hard to manage in the Pacific, but in Asia we can do good aid, and aid is welcomed. It's going to be selectively used, not in every country, but in particular, and especially in the poorer countries, it will be used. And it's a sort of a backstop. Aid helps us deal with those common challenges. Right? Asia does face the risks that Alison mentioned, right? Risks around climate change. Gordon mentioned fragile states. These are things that can disrupt Asia's rise and Asia's growth. And aid is one of the very few tools we have to deal with those common challenges. And then finally, we have to show that aid works, whatever very type it is. We have to be able to demonstrate that it works and that it's valued. So that's my thesis for today. I guess it's mainly for my fellow Australians, but I welcome comments from around the region on how this appears. But to my mind, the challenge is to make our aid more central to our engagement with Asia and to make it less central to our relationship with PNG in the Pacific. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Professor House. Our next speaker will be Dr. Tongquan Sun, who is a researcher in the Rural Development Institute at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Sun has worked on such issues as international aid, social enterprises, microfinance, and rural development. And for 12 years, Dr. Sun worked for the China International Center for Economic and Technical Exchanges at the Ministry of Commerce, which oversees most of China's international aid program to other countries. Dr. Sun will be speaking on the next phase of China's own poverty reduction strategy, the role of international donors, and the impact of such work on China's growing development cooperation program internationally. So, Dr. Sun.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to the organizers to inviting me to be here. I will talk about the future of production in China and a little bit about China's aid to other countries. So there will be 3 points I will talk about. That is, first, challenge of poverty reduction in China. Second, the strategy of poverty reduction in China. And the third one is the aid to the other developing countries. First, about the challenge of poverty reduction in China. That China, maybe as you all know, that China has decreased the rural poor population significantly in the past 30 or 40 years. But the poor population is still very large now. According to, even we use the standard of World Bank, by the end of 2005, this is the latest, I found the figure of the World Bank report, that is, the poor population is 208 million. That the poverty incidence is 27%. If we use the national standard, here, by the end of 2012, we still have the poor population of almost 100 million. So the poverty incidence is about 10%. You may notice that the poverty line increased every year, almost every year. But even now, the standard is a little lower than the World Bank standard. The second challenge is the imbalanced development or benefit to the people. Income gap between the urban and the rural is very, very big. And the deep blue color is for the urban income per capita, and the light blue is for the rural income per capita. So you can see the urban income per capita is almost 3.3 times of the rural ones. And the Gini coefficient is also high. This picture shows that by the end of 2012, the Gini coefficient is 0.474, very, very high, and lasts for several years. The third challenge is the imbalanced geographical distribution of the poor population. The upper picture shows that in the east, we have the biggest population, but in the West, the total rural population, most of the rural population is in the east part. But nearly half of the rural poor population living in the West. This picture shows that the newly identified poorest areas by the central government, they are mainly the mountains, and in the West, you can see the dark areas are the mountains. So, where are the poor? This picture with some people, that is the place where I visited, do a survey there. It's the area of the earthquake last month. That's just in that county. And it's in the mountains, very high mountains. So the people can hardly to have businesses or to plant even vegetables, you know. And the picture with houses is in the Lois Plateau, very poor areas and dry. So it's hard to plant very few plants there. And this land, almost green land, it's Silanlaki, how to say? Silanlaki, yes? Silanlaki land, soil. So it's hard to plant. So list some characters of the poor areas. Now, who are the poor? Old people and children. They are living in the villages. Where are the young? You see, this picture is in a village when I did a survey last year in Henan province. You can see the old ladies, old men, and some young women. The young women, their husbands are not in village. This also, one of our graduate students do a survey with an old lady in the village. Then where the young, they go to cities. So in the village, I ever do survey, almost 40 to 60% of the young people go to urban areas to do work as a migrant workers. So they do construction or in the factory, in the processing lines. So in China's situation, so the fundamental momentum for poverty reduction is economic growth, industrialization, and urbanization. For example, we had a World Bank poverty reduction program in a poor area. The approach is CDD, community-driven development. When we did survey in the village, we can hardly find young people. And the CDD, the core element of the CDD is to have the community members to join in the decision, democratic discussion, management of the community affairs. But old ladies, old men, they have less interest to do it because the benefit or the income from the land plant very little. They rely on the money remitted by their kids from the migrant labor. So if we used a CDD, no one to interested join in. Or yeah, we still have some young or mid-aged people in the village, but they are often they are the leaders, community leaders. As AusAID, it's the World Bank experts should advise us avoid to have the traditional leaders, community leaders involved in the community development programs. Especially, they think China is central government controlled, and they want to give another approach. Yes, the government also want to learn lessons or experiences from international development community that to improve the effectiveness of our poverty reduction programs. But who can take the responsibility? That's a problem. So the fundamental momentum, I think, is economic growth, industrialization, and urbanization. Agricultural modernization. Agricultural modernization, is in China, so many people, the land per capita is very, very low. In the village I visited, the land is only per person is about 6 kilometer programs, even lower some places. So the annual income from the land is not more than 2,000 RMB. That is, if you use Australia dollar, is about 300, not more than 400 US dollars. So we need to collaborate the land, to merge the lands, to scale up. But the land ownership, how to settle ownership. There are too many disputes about land ownership in China. So it's a problem for China. And another way out to have equal development for all the people, the central government raised a slogan, the Chinese dream. The core element of the Chinese dream is provide opportunities for all to have equal development. Then the basic principles of poverty reduction in China, that government-driven, not community development, community-driven. Yeah. And development-oriented. That means self-reliance, depending on yourself, not on others. And then the reform, innovation, and opening up to bring other experiences, successful experiences from outside. Then basically we have 3 patterns of poverty reduction programs. One is the special program earmarked. And the second industry reduction poverty, and that means the sector or departments of the government of different sectors, for example, the irrigation, transportation, healthcare. They all have the responsibilities to join in the poverty reduction. And social poverty reduction, that means all the civil society organizations need to take a responsibility. And the rich provinces in the east part should take one partner in the west part as its target to provide assistance. And armies also take the responsibility to join in the poverty reduction. You may be interested in the international cooperation International cooperation now in poverty reduction in China, mainly on infrastructure, irrigation, ecological, new energy, and community-driven is an approach, not a field. So, as I see, my view, that Chinese poverty reduction is just like sailing in rough water, especially in a transitional period. Now, too many disputes or controversies, so it's really hard for not only for the government but for all the people. Now, let's turn to a little about aid to other developing countries. Now we have some executing agencies here. I mentioned the first three is under MOFCOM, Ministry of Commerce. They are official executing agencies of China's aid. Another two are banks. Now, the last two is NGO, China International Poverty Reduction Center, also NGO. It's a gongo, not a purely NGO. So about the NGO, I want to talk a little more about the NGOs in China. There are not too many NGOs involved in poverty reduction or aid to other countries. As I know, only two. One is this center. Another is the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation. That's maybe the biggest foundation in China in the poverty reduction. The foundation has implemented two projects in Africa. But now, China has not good experiences of having NGO join in development aid. So I have a research team that's doing a program on the study of international regulations on the NGO involving in the poverty or in aid to other countries. So the basic principles you can learn from you got them from the white paper of the Chinese government. I want to emphasize 3 points. First is the equality and the mutual benefit. That's our emphasis. It must be mutual benefit and equality. And self-reliance and independent economic development. It's also experience of China. When we received aid from other countries, we insist on self-reliance, because I have experience of the manager of aid programs in China. So I know how we insist aid independence, reliance. So the third one I want to emphasize is that recipient need plus supply capacity driven, according to the needs and based on our own capacity. So we will not do what we cannot do. So main fields, the main fields, I think it's not quite different from other donor countries. I want to talk a little more about why less information. Yeah, it's a sensitive topic, maybe. Many people said that Chinese aid is not transparent. And there just was a website developed by the Center for Global Development in USA, and you mentioned the figure. I don't know the figure is true or not, but I prefer not to believe it. not too low, but I think maybe too much. Yeah. Even for me, it's a problem to get enough data to analyze the programs. One reason is the domestic public opinions. We have a large population and poor health care, poor education conditions. I can give you my example that my mom have not a pension for 30 years after she quitted her job. And she only get the pension last year for the pension is not about 600 RMB, that is not more than 100 Australian dollars a month. And she cannot get enough health care, medical reimbursement. It's very, very low. And she live with me in Beijing, and she household registration, I don't know you understand it or not, we call it 户口. Yeah, that means where you can live legally. Her household registration is in our hometown. And so the health insurance linked with the household registration. So she cannot get reimbursed if she go to the hospital in Beijing. So it's very common in China now. So if we give too much aid to other countries, then now you can, if you go to visit the websites in Chinese, there are too many criticism. And there already was a serious reaction to the figure you mentioned domestically. And another example is in the Macedonia school bus. When China released the news that we grant the school bus to Macedonia, then that time there was an accident of school bus in China. Very, very poor school bus, the minibus. So the criticism arose. Why you provide so good school bus to other countries, but our children cannot enjoy? They are not safe. They are injured by the accident. So it's a serious problem. And another reason, I think, from the recipient countries, all these reasons, the government official will not talk about. That's my analysis or my thinking. Another is that recipient countries, if we release the figure, then the recipient country may compare with each other. China's developed so fast, why you give them more than me? It's a problem. So that's my thinking about the why less information. And why more infrastructure? Infrastructure is an important part of Chinese aid. One reason is that Chinese notion and experiences. We have a word that is, want to reach, build a road first. That's our experiences. And another reason I think is the comparative advantages. We have the skilled labor forces and sound technology. We build big scale infrastructures, including factories, and low cost, very, very low cost, the cost advantage. So I'd little emphasize on these two issues, why less information and why more infrastructure. I hope to have a better understanding. You have a better understanding of Chinese aid. And I'd like to have more exchanges with you. The less information also puzzled me. And I want to I think it will become better in the future. Now the government is preparing the second white paper of foreign aid. So I expect more information, more transparent in the paper. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sun. You covered a lot of good territory, both China's continuing efforts at poverty reduction at home, as well as the issues of China's growing international aid to other countries. And this question of potentially increasing transparency, more information available over time, and how that might affect the level of domestic support for China's aid is very fascinating. Finally, on our panel, we're going to turn to India, and our speaker will be Dr. Rani Mohan, who is the Director of Indian Development Cooperation Research and a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. She's also an Associate Professor at the College of William and Mary in the United States. She's had a wide range of experience as an analyst on issues of poverty and social policy, as well as work on Afghanistan. Dr. Mohan is going to be speaking on approaches, trends, and priorities of India's growing aid program, a topic that she's been working on in Delhi. So, Dr. Mohan, please.
Thank you very much. I see that we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'll try and go through my slides quickly, but I hope that we have at least 10, 15 minutes, and maybe we can go over a little bit into the lunchtime in order to have a discussion on these issues. I'm struck following the Chinese presentation about some of the similarities between India and China and their development cooperation program. In my presentation, I'm not going to focus on poverty issues within India, but there are great similarities there with China too. India also has about between 25 and 30% of its population still living below the official government poverty line, significant issues of regional inequality, etc. But maybe we can bring those up if you'd like in the discussion. So let me just introduce you and give you some information about Indian aid, which has grown rapidly, particularly in the last decade. It, in the last 10 years, in fact, has quadrupled or increased 4 times in US dollar terms. And the budgeted amount for this next fiscal year is 1.3 billion US dollars. And you can see that's the green line is the total of aid, and that's just grants and including loans, which India is phasing out. So with such a large and growing aid program, I think it's important to understand Chinese aid, Indian aid, and these countries that are scaling up their development cooperation program. It's also important to understand where these programs are coming from. So in India, the government officials do not like the word aid, in fact. So it's an issue also of terminology. And they also feel that calling it emerging is incorrect. India, in fact, gave its first development cooperation grant in 1949, 2 years after it had just itself emerged from independence and colonial rule. And that was to Bhutan and shortly thereafter to Nepal. And I think understanding the historical evolution of Indian development cooperation gives a better sense of not only why it's not emerging, in fact it has been operating in that sphere for several decades, but also why India talks about partnerships and similar to China about a partnership that's mutually beneficial. One has to sort of understand the history where that's coming from. So when Prime Minister Nehru gave the grant to Bhutan, he talked about, sort of the brotherhood of the two countries and emerging from that colonial experience, and that the way forward was to look at partnerships for economic development. And to understand that, looking at 1950s, the Colombo Plan, in fact, when you think about which countries were present, right, it included countries such as Pakistan, which were not democratic. And so the focus early on was to focus on development in the economic realm, so explain underdevelopment then due to economic reasons, and really sidestep the whole political sphere. It was also very early on focused on the sovereignty of countries, that these partnerships were based on a partnership of two mutually, sovereign actors that came together. So a very different historical basis when you look at the Indian Development Cooperation Program from that of the traditional donors. Different not only in self-perception and terminology. We all know that India does not share its development data with DAC. Neither does China, neither does Brazil, right? So it's a little bit harder to understand because there's not as much comparative information on there. But also the way India delivers development cooperation is different, and there are similarities there again with China and indeed amongst the BRICS countries. India prides itself on having a demand-driven selection of development cooperation projects, which means that is the recipient country that determines what is important for it, rather than India saying, well, we think you should be focusing on these areas. India does not give, ostensibly, there are no conditions, so no conditionality on its aid. But then there are also severe capacity issues, especially as India is trying to scale up its development cooperation program. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs is infamously as large as Singapore's Ministry of External Affairs, and it's the Ministry of External Affairs that deals with development cooperation. So they're severely understaffed. This, in part, explains some of the issues on reporting on aid. But there are also issues on monitoring, evaluation, follow-up. Just to give you a brief overview of how India distributes its development cooperation. As I mentioned, coordination is within the Ministry of External Affairs. Last year, they created a new administrative unit, and it's important to point out, again here, similarities amongst the BRICS countries. India does not have a separate aid agency. DPA is in fact a coordinating structure. It's not a policy unit. And so within the Ministry of External Affairs, you have this new structure that started last year, that was put in place last year, called DPA, which coordinates with other ministries Indian development assistance, which includes grants, has traditionally, since the 1960s, included training of personnel, and they've also added a new tool, which India considers part of its development cooperation package, which are lines of credits, and it doesn't fit under the DAC definition of what aid is, but India does consider it part of its development cooperation engagement. Who does India give money to? Who does India engage with? Well, just taking an overview of the last 13 years, the largest recipient by far, not only the last 10 years, but historically, has been Bhutan. Much of this in hydroelectric infrastructure investment, but the second largest is Afghanistan. And India, in fact, is the 5th largest donor to Afghanistan and is likely to play a significantly rising role as international troops get set to leave next year. here similar data just to highlight that when you divide up by years and look at the top recipients, in fact, the majority of grants that India gives go to the region, right? They go to the immediate neighborhood of South Asia, in fact. Then this new tool that India engaged with or started in 2004-2005, which are called the lines of credit managed by India's Exim Bank, the Import-Export Bank of India, which are not a government-to-government, but a Exim Bank to government credit line, but the Indian government subsidizes the interest rate, and it's that part that they consider their development assistance or cooperation. And there, when you look at the amounts, India now has nearly $10 billion in open line of credits. Not only has that volume skyrocketed, but when you look at where those line of credits are going, when they started out in 2004-2005, when they started out giving these lines of credits, about a third went to Africa. This last fiscal year, that amount that was going to Africa is over half of the line of credits given, right? So a huge increase in volume of line of credits and over half of them going to Africa. And you see that there is an emerging differentiation in development cooperation in the immediate neighborhood, which is much more focused on grants and building specific projects, including government administration, whereas the engagement in Africa has a much more commercial focus, and indeed there's great similarities there between India and China also. And when you look at what is driving, for example, India's engagement in Afghanistan, there's significant amount of the money that India gives to Afghanistan is in fact humanitarian aid, vitamin fortified biscuits for feeding. India feeds 2 million children a day in schools in Afghanistan. So there's the whole humanitarian angle. But there's also, there are also several underlying factors that are driving Indian aid. There's this issue of accessing natural resources, not only within Afghanistan, but also in Central Asia. There's also this issue of economic diplomacy, if one can call it that, which is the government goes in and is in fact investing in an Iranian port in Chabahar. The Iranians are building railroad and road linkages up to the western part of Afghanistan. India has built and is working on extending a road within Afghanistan. And India has mining rights now to an iron ore mine, Hajigak mines in Afghanistan. So you can see where development cooperation and in fact grants on building roads are important, but they also benefit India. And then there is this issue of larger competition in the Indian Ocean. I will quickly just go through the slide. I just put this together to help you visualize. So the red dots are China's engagement in different countries, either militarily or investment in ports. And the blue dots are Indian investments. And I think it's very interesting to see, right? You have Indian investment in the Chabahar port, and 100 miles east in Pakistan, you have Chinese investment in a Pakistani port. And of course, both of them are trying to access Afghanistan. And there are a number of such examples. Just quickly, a couple of slides. Why is it important to understand India? Well, if you look at the absolute GDP of the BRICS countries, right, skyrocketing, and in fact, the economy of the BRICS countries are larger than 4, I think, of the DAC countries, right, growing in importance. And I think it was mentioned earlier, DAC aid. In fact, Australia and the UK are outliers. The trend in overall DAC aid is a downward trend. This last year, the report was just released last month. DAC aid overall has gone down by 4% and 2% the previous year. So the trend is, taken as a whole, a downward trend amongst OECD countries and an increasing trend amongst countries like India and China, and that's why it's important to understand this. Just a couple of food for thought issues here. Of course, countries like India are still grappling with severe poverty and inequality issues. But India's own lesson from its history of development cooperation is that a country can, in fact, be both a donor and a recipient, or indeed a partner in development. And India has engaged in development cooperation for decades. And interestingly, I've heard from a number of countries, government officials from countries such as Afghanistan, that they in fact find Indian development assistance more effective, or more, they would like more of that than, say, USAID. And when I probe them on why, they say, well, look at the overhead costs of USAID, right? The consultants, the international consultants, are charging a huge overhead. And so out of $100, maybe 20 will actually reach the people on the ground in Afghanistan. Whereas the Indian government, because it actually channels, due to capacity issues and due to its philosophy, channels much more through the government directly, more of that is going to get to the government and the people on the ground in Afghanistan. Of course, it has much lower overhead costs also. So some food for thought there in terms of aid effectiveness. And then I think, if ODA does not, in fact, rethink its development paradigm and how one should think about this, they might, in the medium to longer term, become irrelevant. Because countries such as India, China, Brazil don't want to be rule takers when they can be rule makers. And we recently saw that in the announcement of the creation of the BRICS Bank. So engaging India and China in a rising Asia will need a rethinking of the old development paradigm towards partnership and towards efforts of triangulation, where Australia works together with India to deliver better and more effective aid to Afghanistan, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mullen. A lot of food for thought, and I wish we had more time for questions, but we have a little bit of time. So let me open the floor, and as with the previous session, if you could please just state your name and affiliation. We're going to take a few questions and then let the panelists respond collectively to all the questions rather than individual answers. I think that will be more efficient. Yes, sir, in the front.
Thank you for those fantastic explanations of the situation, particularly in China and India. I want to ask about the poverty estimates that the World Bank has for China and India. My understanding is that the 1981 estimates of the proportion of the population under $1.25 a day were about 80% for China and 60% for India. Firstly, how is it that can be the case when many other measures of poverty and social welfare were much higher in China? And secondly, what do you think that means in terms of the value of $1.25 a day as a measurement of poverty?
Okay, let's take some more questions. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. It's Bina Fernandez from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and my question's for the two presenters on India and China. There was a similarity, obviously, between both in the sense that both India and China are looking for mutual benefit when they're donors. And the question then is, does that mean that we really need to think about the principles of aid effectiveness, as in the principles India and China are subscribing to are a different set, perhaps, than the Paris Declaration or the aid effectiveness kinds of principles. So, do we need to be rethinking those principles on a global level, or are we heading in a direction of everybody just defining their own sets of principles?
Good, thank you. Yes.
My name is Stephen Sherlock. I'm the Director of the Centre for Democratic Institutions at the Australian National University. My question is prompted by Dr. Mullen's final and interesting and perhaps quite provocative comments about the potential irrelevancy of DAC. But when I listen to your presentation about the Indian aid program, I hear rhetoric about difference, but the substance, I wonder how different it is from traditional DAC-driven assistance. So I wonder if the challenge to DAC is not so much a developmental one in terms of developmental approach, but rather a political one. It's a question of diplomatic competition.
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to ask regarding good governance and aid. There's a lot of talk about. It's sort of widely acknowledged that poor governance in a country can lower the effectiveness of aid, and you alluded to that. But it's often the place when aid is needed the most. How can we deal with that, the issue of good governance and promoting good governance without lowering the legitimacy and the sort of self-reliance of governments? And I mean, obviously, a lot of the time we need to account for the differences between countries, but is there a common framework we should be looking through when trying to understand how best to promote good governance in a recipient country?
Thank you very much indeed. That was really interesting. I just want to come back maybe to where the discussion began with Mr. Brazier and Stephen Howes. I want to challenge this slight sort of, I'm sure you didn't mean this, but there was a slight sense in, it was with Rod actually, but I kind of, Stephen, you, in a way, some of the things you said sort of, I think potentially challenged it without doing it up front, which is this notion that there is a set of countries for whom traditional development assistance will continue, and then there's a set of countries for whom, by the very nature of their dynamism and changing geography, so we have to do things differently. And I'd like to challenge that. I mean, it seems to me that this landscape we're talking about is actually changing it everywhere, and that actually elements of the low-income country model that has been the stock in trade of DAC donors for so long also needs to change. And it needs to change in part because of actors like India and China, but not exclusively, part because of what we know, what the evidence is telling us about what works, but also the fact we're embracing new knowledge, new technology, new ways of doing things, even in least developed countries and fragile countries. So really just wanting to put up the challenge that we need to avoid falling into the trap of assuming there are a set of countries for whom the old ways of doing business in aid will do. And that actually we need to expose it all to sort of new frameworks and new ways of thinking.
Okay, maybe we'll take one or two more and then give our panelists a chance to respond to a very challenging set of questions. Yes, sir.
Dan Evans, Business for Millennium Development. One of our member companies is a Gates partially funded product development partnership, creates anti-malaria drugs in the absence of Big Pharma doing it. Question for Dr. Sun. Is part of the answer to China's dilemma to, in fact, do what it does well, malaria drugs, because of artemisinin uniquely growing in China? The answer may be leverage your own industry, get WHO pre-qualification so you have a world-accepted medicine, and then use that for your aid program, which is what you're doing right now with an injectable drug that's the last line of defense for cerebral malaria. So there may be an answer here that works well for China, works well for the developing world. So a comment on that.
All right, maybe one more question. Yes, sir.
Krishna Hort from the Nossal Institute at University of Melbourne. I guess mine's more a comment than a question, which might make it easier to respond to. The word narrative emerges quite a bit in the discussions of the panel. It seems that each country is looking for a narrative for its aid program. And it just makes me think, again, the reflection on we've got a domestic constituency as well as the government and the recipient governments, if you like. Is there something interesting or unique about aid programs in that there is a narrative that we have to sell, which sort of justifies what it's doing, which may or may not link to the reality, the actuality of what's going on? Thanks.
Good. Let me turn to our panelists to try to respond to those questions and comments that seemed most relevant to their presentations. Maybe I could ask Dr. Mullen to go first.
First question was on the $1.25 a day, the World Bank data. In fact, I have not looked at the data from the World Bank. The data that I was talking about is the Indian government's own poverty line on what constitutes poverty in the Indian context, and there in fact have been issues with that poverty line because it was rethought in 2000 and the measurements changed. India actually has pretty good data on that, but when you change how you measure it, it becomes a bit more controversial and what that means in terms of trends. But undoubtedly, I think when you look over the last 15 years or so, poverty rates have come down in India. I think that is not disputed. The how much and where is, but I think overall, but you know, even if it's just 25%, when you're talking about 1.2 and above billion people, you're talking about a significant, right? 300 million people living below a very low poverty line that the Indian government has. So I can't speak for the Chinese data and how that compares, but there are significant issues with an increasingly urban face of poverty in India, poverty being concentrated in northern India as opposed to southern states, etc. And so significant issues that India itself is still grappling in terms of you might only have 25%, but then there are a lot more who are living very close to that poverty line, who are just barely surviving and are very could easily fall into poverty. The issue of aid effectiveness and how we should sort of as a global community think about it, I think is important because, and that was the point I was trying to make, that if you sort of set goals and ideas on what aid effectiveness should be composed of, but you don't include, as is in the case of DAC, the countries that are starting to give more aid, in fact, and who are, India's aid program at 1.3 billion this next year is comparable to Austria's aid program. Austria is a small European country, but it has a significantly higher per capita income, right? So as these countries, as India and China start to or are increasing their aid budgets, they have to be part of that discussion. And that ties into this question of whether the aid or development cooperation programs are indeed that different, or whether it's an issue of diplomatic competition and indeed political language. I think part of it is that, right? And part of it, when you think about why did India, China, Brazil, et cetera, come together and announce the BRICS Bank? Well, in the lead up to that, India was pushing to get a seat on the UN Security Council. The countries have asked for better representation in the voting rights, IMF and World Bank. It's that non-inclusion that in fact drives many of them to say, well, why should we conform to DAC standards that you came up with without including us in discussions, and we are just asked to deliver aid data, share our aid data with you, who came up with these norms that are quite different because they don't conform to India's history. I'm actually not an Indian citizen, so I can't talk for the Indian government or the Indian people, but I think it's important to understand where these countries are coming from, what their history is in development cooperation, in order to broaden who gets to be included in forums such as this one. Aid and poor governance, is there need for a rethinking of the framework? I think this is a huge issue. It's an issue in India. The Indian government is barely functioning these days, let alone having any capacity to think about their development cooperation programs. So, and we know that in India, for example, some of the states that have the highest concentration of poverty, Uttar Pradesh in the north, some of the northeastern states, are also the states where you have significant governance problems, right? So how to tackle that is key, I think. But the Indian approach has been not to get involved in those kind of discussions because, as I mentioned, the political aspects are sidestepped. So while India gives money to Afghanistan to build their parliament building or to, I actually don't know what happened, but I think they were offering some development cooperation to the Solomon Islands for elections. So while they do those kind of things, there's little discussion within India about governance with regard to their development cooperation program. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Singh?
Yeah. About the data, I have very few, less knowledge about it. So, but I think poverty is a comprehensive thing. So, not only the income. So in China, even we use the poverty line, it's still low, but we also pay attention to the educational issues, healthcare issues, and public services like transportation, power, and some financial services, and all concerned with the production and income generation. About the second question, mutual benefit and something with effectiveness. Yes, mutual benefit is one principle of China, but it doesn't mean that we will not provide unilateral aid. In fact, China provides much humanitarian aid to the other countries. And mutual benefit, I think, can improve the effectiveness of aid. For example, the Chinese experiences that China provide the projects to African countries to build processing factories. And we have so many extra laborers, so we can use our workers to build factory. Yeah, there's a dispute about the workers from China and not use the local workers. But the fact is that China has so many extra workers, and they are relatively skilled and can make the project more effective and efficient. So the 8 projects are mainly sometimes implemented by companies, commercial companies, so they have to be efficient to make their own profit. So and the recipient countries get the factory they want, and the Chinese companies get the profit they want. So I think it's a mutual benefit and improved effectiveness of the aid. As to the competition between the traditional donors and the other emerging ones, so-called emerging ones, in fact, China has started its aid in 1950s. Yeah. I don't think from China's side there are not so much competition. More and more DAC countries try to collaborate with China. How to collaborate? As I understand from my view, some countries raised the question to the Chinese counterparts, and they want Chinese to follow their rules, their procedures, the standards they set up. But the facts shows that Chinese aid is more effectiveness or more popular to the recipient countries. Why should we follow your rules? That's a question. So I don't mean that we did right. I mean we need have an equal position to talk about this, not just follow your rules. We also need, I suggest to my friends in the government, we need to have serious and deep analysis of the effectiveness of Chinese aid, why we are popular for to the recipient countries, why so much criticism to the Western or the traditional donors. I don't mean the traditional donors do wrongly, but we need a serious research on it. So as to the governance and the effectiveness, governance and effectiveness, yes, it's always have many disputes on it. If I don't know which one, or it's an egg and the chicken question. But what I have seen is that when China provide aid to the recipient countries with less consideration of governance, or somebody said no consideration about governance, but effectiveness is there and benefit the local people. Yeah, China has so many problems to solve, but I have seen the effectiveness. So I have not, in this case, I have not seen a close linkage or causality between governance and effectiveness. So I suggest, or I myself will do some more research on this issue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sun. And I think on the question about malaria, maybe you could take that up over the lunch, if that's all right. Let's give Stephen and Rod a chance to respond, including to Allison's question.
Is this on? Okay, it's on now. Very, very quickly, I do want to try to. I don't think there's a risk of overstating this stark division between the DAC traditional donors and the new so-called new donors. As some have said, some so-called new emerging donors have been donors for a long time. but also some new emerging donors are fully embracing the principles of the DAC. South Korea, Turkey, Mexico are all members of the DAC and are fully subscribed to the principles. Australia never tells China to do as we do, and that's the whole purpose of the agreement we've recently struck with them. It forms a platform that we can have discussions around issues, and we've already had good discussions with them about the indebtedness issue of small Pacific Island states, and they're very productive. There's no rancour or competition in the room on that. So I think that there is sensitivity sometimes, but you don't feel it when you're actually in the room, official to official. On governance, it's absolutely critical, but these days we are under pressure to measure impact and demonstrate impact in short time frames. And so it's a challenge for officials like me to ensure that governance continues to take its rightful place, because without good governance, a lot of the other things we do are very hard to deliver. So we are trying to ensure that it doesn't lose prominence. On the very, very good question about the old ways of doing business in will do, and that they may be sort of bereft of innovation. I think that I didn't want to give that impression. I think it's more about the way we adapt in very dynamic countries of Asia than not saying that those countries that lack that sort of economic dynamism will just do things the way we have always done. I shouldn't have given you that impression if I did, but it's really for us in these fast-growing places, how do you connect the poor to these sources of prosperity? And that's usually a job or improved government services, and that's our focus. In some of the places that lack this dynamism, the jobs are hard to come by, and the capacity in government to deliver services is a little less. On the question about the narrative, it has to be much more than just a fig leaf. It's got to make sense. It's got to be robust, and it's got to hold water in an audience of people like Stephen and to the people at the footy games tomorrow. And the MDGs are good, I think, in that sense. They were simple, readily understood by experts and non-experts alike, and that's our challenge in Asia. Finally, on the question of aid, Rani mentioned the view, and Professor Sun also talked about Chinese and Indian aid being appreciated more. I don't dispute that people say that, but of course it depends who you talk to, doesn't it? It depends if you're talking to officials, and of course if they're talking to us, they'll probably say that they like our aid a lot too. And of course they do say that all the time to us. There is commonly, there's a phrase used in the Pacific, it's called Boomerang Aid. That's this perception that Australian aid is used to pay for expensive advisors who come and fly in and fly out. And of course we don't want to be perceived that way, but we also challenge a little bit this idea that if you are procuring expertise or services or goods from another part of the world, somehow that's not a good use of aid. The money itself is a medium of exchange, and you're buying things that are delivered to that country. So I think we do need to unpack a little some of these sometimes a little too convenient tags that are attached to some of the work we do. Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll give the last word to Stephen.
Okay. Thanks. I'll be brief. I know we're out of time. Just a few points that haven't come up already. Someone asked about the Paris Declaration. I think the Paris Declaration is well and truly dead and buried, and has been for a long time. It's just a sort of, we can't quite, come out and say that. But I think
You can say it.
I can, because I left AusAID. But yeah, even before the emerging donors came along, Paris Declaration really was struggling, and certainly with the emerging donors, some of the principles are still very important, partnership and so on, but as a way of operating, I don't think it really has much traction or relevance anymore. On the other hand, I agree with Rod, and we shouldn't think the DAC is dead. We shouldn't overstate this or see this as a crisis. It's good. that there's more aid coming from other donors, and not everyone is going to join DAC. I mean, if you join the OECD, you'll join DAC, but if you don't join the OECD, you're not going to join DAC, and I don't think China is going to join the OECD. So how this will resolve, whether it will, I don't know. We've sort of moved from the G8 to the G20, so kind of got some resolution on that, but whether we can, resolve specific issues like aid in the New World Order remains to be seen. I think whether or not we do formally, there'll be some convergence. The traditional donors will emphasize more kind of commercial imperatives, since that's what emerging donors are doing. Emerging donors will, over time, become more transparent, as colleagues have mentioned, and they will face issues of effectiveness. I think that whole question of governance, that's, traditional donors have tried to do that, and probably not with much success, and that's one reason they're not liked so much. All those advisors, what do they achieve? On the other hand, you can go and build something, but you have the white elephant problem, and we see that in the Pacific. Right? There are assets built, by the Chinese government that are not now being used. Right? And so that issue of effective aid, sustainability, that traditional donors have had to grapple with, I think emerging donors will as well. So I think there will be some convergence, but whether it will be formalised, I don't know. And finally, on the narrative, I think, if you want to have a small aid program, which no one notices, which is what we had in Australia in the 70s and the 80s and 90s, then you don't really need a narrative. But if you want to have a big aid program, which is what we tried to achieve in the last decade, then you do need to have a narrative. And I think we've had a narrative, but we need a new narrative for the next decade.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Well, we're over the time, and I apologize for that, but I think the presentations were so interesting and provocative, and as were the questions from you all. So I think it was well worth it. Please join me in thanking our presenters.